sensory diet essentially is food for the nervous system to help it operate better, right? So when you are processing information from a sensory perspective, you are either responding in two ways. You're either hypersensitive to something or you are hypo-responsive. So when you're hypersensitive, it means that it is too much for you. And when you are hypo-responsive, it means that you crave it. And we have 7 senses, right? So we have sight, we have vision, we have hearing, we have movement, we have pressure, we have touch, we have smell, we have taste. So I think there's more. There's invisible ones, right? So with that being said, you can be hyper responsive to them, right? And you can be hypo responsive. So the only one that you cannot be hyper responsive to is proprioceptive input. Like you don't really get bothered by that. That's more that you get bothered by the touch of the pressure, which is like on your skin, the tactile. Examples of hyper responsiveness is if someone slams a door and the child screams and covers their ears, right? That's when the size of the problem or the stimulus doesn't match the size of the reaction is when we see challenges with sensory processing. And a lot of people do have unique sensory processing challenges to them, but they're still able to function, right? And we're not here to over pathologize children. We're here to make them functional for where they should be developmentally, which is developmentally appropriate to them and where they're at.
It is our job as adults to really be able to give our children in general like the richest exposure to all kind of elements, and then kind of see, oh wow, what do they veer away from and what are they driven towards. The real idea behind the sensory diet is just self-regulation, right? And to find that just right place for our children so they can actually function.
A sensory diet is basically recommendations for whatever sensory systems are having issues from your therapist. So if your child is seeking a lot of vestibular input, which is movement, that typically involves sensory-based activities that are related to movement. So that might be like rolling or crawling or swinging in particular swings and swinging in particular positions to stimulate the the vestibular system in your inner ear. And those should be unique to what your child's vestibular system needs. But you also want to make sure you're ruling out any nutritional deficits or sleeping issues or airway issues too, because if you're not looking at those things, then like sensory strategies won't be as effective because we're not really getting to the source, right? So your sensory diet is a recommendation to whatever your sensory profile is exhibiting to your clinician.
Sensory diets, it's more about a sensory profile and really being observant and getting to know your child. Part of my job is helping the parents and caregivers to see what I'm seeing and notice what I'm seeing, and then know that that is their child really communicating that they have concerns or fears or something is too loud or something is too light, and that is why their little bodies react this way. So really my job is, I feel, to educate parents on what all of those sensory factors are and knowing how those can be addressed depending on the setting that you're in. I think that these guidelines can be given and you can start to create a morning, afternoon, and night kind of sensory diet, if you will, and kind of the activities that can be included and or tools that can be included in their sensory diet. But always you're kind of looking at the outcome. So anything I might give you, it's like, okay, let's take this in, and it's really just understanding the why.
Sensory diets are very unique and tailored to the individual. There isn't like a general, oh, this sensory diet works for this kid. Like there's sensory strategies that are like that. Like, oh, if your kid looks like they've got the wiggles, yeah, have them jump on a trampoline. That typically should help, right? Have them sit on a wiggle seat, have them build a fort and crash up and down and all that kind of stuff. That's going to help that. Typically that will help that nervous system because they're getting the sensory input they need to be more regulated. That's like a universal rule, but that's a strategy. That's not a diet. But sensory diets are a plethora of strategies compiled for that specific nervous system.
When building these sensory kind of profiles or sensory diets, if you will, it's really so different for each child. And basically it's meeting them where they're at and then just gently guiding them and letting them know that we understand and here and feel the same thing. And although we might not be scared or it doesn't affect us in the same way, that we're like, wow, I get where you're coming from, right? And instead of telling even a child to like calm down, it's to feed back to them like, wow, I see that made you really excited. And now it's time for us to kind of walk into school and let's get prepared. What does it take to, what do you think your body needs right now? That obviously that's a little bit of a process, but that is the aim and the goal of a sensory diet in general.
They should definitely seek out professional occupational therapists, and they should seek out a comprehensive evaluation where that clinician is trained in sensory processing. And if that child is available for standardized testing to look at the actual motor skills and motor levels of that child, that clinician should be evaluating their motor skills, because the sensory systems are the foundation for your motor skills. So as clinicians, our job is to always be a detective and find out what's happening and why, because the why is how we're going to go about addressing it. And I think that's something that a lot of parents don't know, like asking, do you do standardized testing? Can you share the results with me afterwards? Can we have a Zoom call where you break that down for me and you send me that, right? And then you get a report about it. And then as they get to know your kid, you also have to give the clinician the grace to get to know your child. As much as I would love to be robotic and be very efficient about this, humans are like very complicated onions with lots of layers. And we're just a big system of systems on systems that pump and dump and integrate and work together. And there's a honeymoon period that we call it. And there's like a 4 to 6 week period where kids are on their best behavior. They're not showing all their cards, all that, right? And so things might change in the first 2 months of therapy in the process. And we might say, oh, when you first came in, like he wasn't really seeking a lot of input, but that kid might know to like, just like keep it all together in a new setting. Or he might know that like he's, perfectly behaved at school, but mom's reporting crazy behaviors at home. And then all of a sudden, a week 4 here, we start to see those behaviors. We're like, oh, okay, now I know what you're talking about, mom, right? And that happens a lot. So you also have to give your therapist like the grace and the time to get to know this like very complex set of systems.
I typically like to observe a child in their school, in their home, and then in a clinic-based setting, and then possibly even out in an outdoor setting and park. I can work with kids for years, and then we're like, oh wow, we're doing really good, and we're able to, in this setting, in this hour with me, we can get to all of these things. You take them out to the beach and it's a free-for-all, and you're asking them to touch grass, and there are loud things that we don't have, control of. There's sand, there's water, there's all of these things that I guess where I want to also make a note of is our sensory system and the sensory diet, if you will. It's where a child can feel safe. And mostly I will always be guiding and watching the eyes of a child that kicks in the reflexes. So when you're watching the eyes, they tell you everything, when they're just right there in fear paralysis, if you will, from auditory stimulation being so loud. And so once again, I would like to really educate all parents on, and caregivers and people in general, is just feeding that back to them of like, oh yeah, you're right. I heard that too. That was really loud. That was a fire engine, or there's loud trucks going over. Because then our system, from that fight or flight aspect, we can actually go, oh wow, great, you heard that also. Don't give up after one time. You need to trial and expose them to, once again, way more often than just that one time. Many parents will be like, wow, they didn't like it. We tried the brushing and they didn't like it. So we just kind of gave up and stopped. So what I would say to that is, if you've tried it at one point in their lives, once they've reached a certain level of neurological and developmental, like more maturity, they might be ready for it now, because a lot of this sensory input really works hand in hand with reflex integration, and that is development in its own right. I wouldn't say it really is based on the diagnosis. as much as it's based on the circumstance of their diagnosis. For instance, Down syndrome, it is typically a little bit low tone, right? So really what they might be lacking is a little bit more of the sensation. So they can really benefit from having a little bit of the proprioceptive input and joint stability, like pushing barrels, or small baby furniture or something, to whatever degree they're at, so they can kind of get that input and sensory feedback. And that might be similar to what you would do for a child with ADHD that really actually has to have more physical exertion. So I would probably have more of the vestibular input, but paired with the heavy work and weight bearing instances, but aimed at like kind of calming their system.
I would encourage parents, one, to work with Undivided to help them navigate the insurance system and to navigate the school systems and to really learn how to advocate for themselves and their child. Then I would read the book, Sensory Processing the Child. And it was written by Jane Eyres, and it's a really good book that's like a textbook, and it talks to you about how to kind of understand your child's sensory profile. There's also like Pink Oatmeal is a resource for doing like sensory-based motor activities to help like motor function with kids. And I would look towards those people who can kind of help you piece together your child's sensory profile, and through whether it's courses or Instagram posts or TikToks or YouTubes or things like that, and see what breadcrumbs you can put together.
It's always the goal to teach the child themselves to have that self-awareness. So it's not really for us to be implementing a sensory diet, if you will. It's really to help our children understand why they may like something or not like something, and really always be mindful of our language that we're using to help feed it back to their little system.
I'm all for teaching kids about their overall neurological function and how they process information and how things work with them, specifically to them. And when a lot of parents keep that from their kids, I think a lot of kids are blindsided from it when they're older, and they are curious as to why they have to go to therapy, or why they have to do this or these after school activities, or why are things taking longer with them. And I think empowering them and just teaching them that they have the ability to make those choices and choose for themselves. And here is a bunch of choices that a professional helped create with them that can really get to the bottom of it and help them. There's nothing better, because it teaches your child to like have independence and empower them to know that they are in control of their body and their nervous system, whether they're 3 or 4 or whether they're 24 or 44, right? It's a life skill to be able to do that. And I think that that's something that's really important, that as a parent, you need to know that information and not just leave it up to the therapist to implement it on Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11:30 when they're being pulled out for OT.